Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. Everett Gray stared through the two-way mirror at his wife, Sabrina, as she sobbed dramatically for the cameras. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in perfect, tragic streaks as she clutched a photo of their twins, 6-year-olds Dylan and Bella. "My husband," she choked out, her voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "He tampered with our car, cut the brake lines. He wanted us all dead." She looked directly into the camera. "He wanted the insurance money more than he wanted his family." Detective Hugo Sutter placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Everett noted the lingering touch, the slight squeeze. Something familiar there. Too familiar. Behind Everett, his attorney, Colin Mordell, whispered, "Don't react. That's exactly what they want." Everett nodded, his face a mask of stone. 15 years of marriage to Sabrina had taught him to hide his emotions. Their story had begun at Westbridge University, where they'd met as students. Everett studying mechanical engineering, Sabrina pursuing communications with a minor in theater. The irony didn't escape him now. "They're calling you the family killer," Colin said, sliding over a newspaper. "The press has already convicted you." Everett's company, Gray Precision Engineering, had secured a government contract 6 months ago. The success should have been the highlight of his career, but it had coincided with subtle changes in Sabrina. Late nights, deleted text messages, new lingerie he never saw, the classic signs he'd been too busy to notice. 3 weeks ago, Everett had picked up Sabrina's phone by mistake and seen a message preview from Hugo that read, "When can we meet again? I can't stop thinking about." The text disappeared before he could read more. When he'd asked casually about anyone named Hugo, Sabrina had laughed it off. "Probably Hugo from accounting. We're working on the charity fundraiser together." Everett had let it go, deciding to trust her. Now, watching her performance for the news cameras, he realized his mistake. "The prosecution has your financial records," Colin continued. "They're building the case that you were in debt, that the life insurance policies on Sabrina and the kids, $2 million total, gave you motive. Those policies were Sabrina's idea," Everett said quietly. "And your fingerprints are all over the brake line and under the hood. It's my car. I do routine maintenance myself." Colin nodded. "The DA knows that, but they'll argue you used your engineering expertise to make it look like an accident." Everett's gaze remained fixed on Sabrina as Detective Sutter handed her a tissue. Their fingers touched longer than necessary. "She planned this," Everett said, "and I think I know who helped her." Colin followed his gaze to Detective Sutter. "The lead detective on your case. That would be convenient for her." "I need to get out of here, Colin. My children are with Sabrina's sister. Safe for now. Let me handle this. I'll get you bail." As Colin left, Everett looked down at his hands, the same hands that had built his company from nothing, that had cradled his newborn twins, that had trusted and been betrayed. These hands would not remain shackled for long. And once free, they would dismantle the perfect frame that Sabrina and her lover had constructed. The anger that flared within him was not hot and volatile. It was cold, precise, and patient. Like the machines he engineered to exacting specifications, Everett began calculating the steps needed to disassemble the trap he'd been placed in. Behind Sabrina's performance, he could see the truth in her eyes. Not sorrow, but triumph. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what she'd awakened. The county detention center smelled of industrial bleach and desperation. Everett sat in the visitation room, orange jumpsuit hanging loosely on his frame. 2 weeks of jail food and sleepless nights had hollowed his cheeks, but his eyes remained sharp and analytical. Across from him, Colin slid documents across the table. "The prosecution's discovery. It's worse than I thought." Everett scanned the pages with an engineer's precision. The case against him appeared airtight. Financial records showing the business struggling despite the government contract. Life insurance policies updated 6 months ago. His browser history showing searches about car accidents and brake failures. I never searched for any of this, Everett said, tapping the paper. Colin nodded. Someone accessed your computer. Maybe while you were sleeping, maybe remotely. Sabrina isn't technically savvy enough for that, but her boyfriend might be. Colin lowered his voice. I had my investigator look into Detective Sutter. He worked cybercrimes for 3 years before homicide. Everett leaned back, pieces clicking together. What about the brake lines? The forensics. They claimed the cut was made with precision. Clean. Professional. The kind an engineer would make. And the crash itself. Sabrina and the twins walked away with minor injuries. Colin said, his expression tight. The crash happened on Crestwood Road, a 15 miles per hour zone with a safety barrier precisely where the car hit. Almost as if she knew exactly where to crash for maximum drama. Minimum risk, Everett finished. There's more, Colin continued. I've been digging into Sutter's case records. 3 of his previous arrests involved spouses accused of attempting to murder their partners. All 3 ended in convictions. All 3 had significant insurance policies involved. You think he's done this before? Helped frame people? Colin shrugged. I don't have proof. But it's a pattern worth investigating. Everett's mind raced through calculations and probabilities. I need something concrete, Colin. Something that puts either Sabrina or Sutter at the scene tampering with the car. We've got a hearing for bail tomorrow. Judge Felicia Clarkson. She's tough, but fair. Everett barely heard him. His focus had shifted to his twins. Have you seen Dylan and Bella? Colin's expression softened. Your sister-in-law's been allowed supervised visits. They're asking for you. Sabrina's sister has temporary custody, but she's completely under Sabrina's influence. Iris saw them. What did they say? Everett asked, referring to his own sister. Dylan mentioned something strange. He said, Mommy had a friend help fix the car the night before the accident. A friend who wasn't Daddy. Everett's eyes narrowed. Did he see this friend? No. He heard voices in the garage after he was supposed to be asleep. Thought it was you at first, but realized the voice was different. For the first time in weeks, Everett felt a flicker of hope. We need to find out if anyone saw Sutter at my house that night. Already on it. And I've hired a forensic team, independent from the police lab. If there's evidence under that hood that doesn't match your DNA profile, we'll find it. Everett nodded, his mind shifting from defense to offense. We need to look into Sabrina's financials too. Not our joint accounts. She must have something separate I don't know about. What are you thinking? Sabrina doesn't do anything without a backup plan. This isn't just about insurance money. There's something else. As Colin gathered the documents, Everett added, and check property records. Look for anything purchased in the last year that isn't in our names. Colin raised an eyebrow. You suspect real estate. Sabrina always talked about a lake house in the Pinnicliff Mountains, somewhere just for her when she needed space. Everett's lips formed a thin line. I think she's been planning her exit strategy for a while. The twins and I just became inconvenient variables in her equation. After Colin left, Everett returned to his cell. He lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, mentally reconstructing the events leading to the crash. Sabrina had insisted on taking the car that day, though she usually preferred her SUV for transporting the twins. She'd been adamant despite his offer to drive them himself. In the quiet of his cell, Everett made a silent promise to his children. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about protecting them from a mother who had been willing to risk their lives for her scheme. As the lights dimmed for the night, Everett's resolve hardened. He had built precision machines all his life. Now he would build something else, the perfect counterframe. 3 weeks earlier, Sabrina Gray checked her appearance one last time in the rearview mirror, dabbing at her lipstick before turning to smile at the twins in the back seat. Ready for ice cream after school, my loves. Dylan and Bella cheered, their matching dark curls bouncing with excitement. They had Everett's eyes. Observant, curious, always noticing details. Is Daddy meeting us? Bella asked. No, sweetie. Daddy's very busy today. Sabrina's smile remained fixed as she pulled into traffic. What the twins didn't know, what Everett didn't know, was that the family SUV was now parked 3 blocks away in the lot of an abandoned strip mall. Detective Hugo Sutter had helped her move it before dawn, then followed her home in his personal vehicle. The sedan they were currently in, Everett's car, the one he meticulously maintained, had been prepared the night before. Not sabotaged enough to cause a fatal crash, but enough to create a plausible accident. Hugo had been careful, wearing gloves as he worked under the hood while Sabrina kept watch. Remember, he'd instructed, aim for the barrier on Crestwood. Low speed, deploy the airbag, but minimize impact. The brake line will be compromised enough to give you an excuse, but not enough to make the car completely uncontrollable. Now, as Sabrina drove along the planned route, she glanced at her watch. The timing needed to be precise. A patrol car would happen to be nearby to respond immediately. An officer who wouldn't ask too many questions and would document exactly what Hugo had coached her to say. 15 years with Everett had taught Sabrina how to manipulate him. The quiet engineer had been the perfect husband on paper, stable, successful, devoted to their children. But the perfect husband had become the perfect mark. The life insurance policies had been her first move, suggested casually after a colleague's sudden death. Everett, ever practical, had agreed. Then came the careful construction of financial troubles for his company. Not enough to alarm him, but enough to establish motive. Hugo had helped with that too, using his police connections to access and slowly manipulate their financial records. The final touch had been the computer searches conducted late at night while Everett slept. A trail of evidence pointing to premeditation. As Sabrina approached Crestwood Road, she felt a moment of hesitation. The twins were chattering happily in the back seat, unaware of what was about to happen. She pushed the doubt away. They would be fine. Scared, but fine. The crash would be controlled, and afterward, they would have their mother to comfort them, to tell them how their father had tried to hurt them all. "Monty, you missed the turn for school," Dylan said, his watchful eyes catching the deviation from their usual route. "We're taking a different way today," Sabrina replied smoothly. "A shortcut." As she rounded the corner onto Crestwood, she took a deep breath. The safety barrier loomed ahead, a low concrete wall designed to prevent cars from going into the drainage ditch beyond. Perfect for her purposes, Sabrina pressed the brake pedal. As expected, it went farther than normal, but still engaged. She pressed harder, feigning panic, then swerved toward the barrier. "Mommy," Bella screamed. The impact was jarring but controlled, exactly as planned. The airbag deployed, striking Sabrina with enough force to leave bruises. The twins, secured in their booster seats, were jerked forward but protected by their seatbelts. Silence filled the car for 3 heartbeats. Then Sabrina began to scream, "My babies, are you okay?" The brakes, they didn't work. Tears came easily as she unbuckled herself and turned to check the twins. Both were crying, but uninjured beyond minor seatbelt bruises. Perfect. Within minutes, as expected, a patrol car pulled up. Officer Calvin Reyes, right on schedule. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he called, running toward the vehicle. Sabrina stumbled from the car, clutching her side as if injured. "My children," she gasped. "Please help my children." As Officer Reyes helped Dylan and Bella from the car, Sabrina delivered the line she'd rehearsed countless times. The brakes failed. They didn't work. She looked up with tear-filled eyes. "My husband, he was working on the car last night. He's been acting so strange lately." Officer Reyes's eyes widened as he caught her implication, exactly as Hugo had predicted. "Ma'am, are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Sabrina sobbed. "I don't want to believe it, but the insurance policies, he made us get them updated recently. Said it was just being responsible, but..." She let her voice trail off, planting the seed. Within an hour, Detective Hugo Sutter arrived at the scene, maintaining a professional distance as he took her statement. His eyes conveyed the message. Everything is going according to plan. That evening, as the twins slept in a hospital room under observation, Sabrina gave her first interview to a local reporter who Hugo had tipped off. With practiced vulnerability, she voiced her terrible suspicions about her husband. By morning, Everett Gray was being brought in for questioning. By evening, he was under arrest for attempted murder. Watching the news coverage from her sister's home, Sabrina allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1 complete. Soon, Everett would be convicted. The insurance policy on him, the one he didn't know existed, would pay out once he was imprisoned for attempting to murder his family. Combined with the twins' trust funds that she would gain control of as their sole guardian, Sabrina and Hugo would have nearly $5 million to start their new life. In another part of town, Everett sat in a holding cell, still in shock. As the reality of his situation settled over him, his engineer's mind began analyzing what had happened. Someone had set him up, and in that moment, he made a vow. Whoever had engineered this frame would discover they had made a fatal miscalculation. All rise for the Honorable Judge Felicia Clarkson. Everett stood alongside Colin as the judge entered the courtroom. After 3 weeks in county lockup, the bail hearing was his first chance at freedom and his first opportunity to see Sabrina face to face since his arrest. She sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in a conservative navy dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a modest ponytail. Beside her sat Detective Sutter, maintaining a professional distance, but close enough to offer support. Everett noticed Sutter's hand briefly touch Sabrina's shoulder as the judge entered, a gesture that appeared comforting to observers, but revealed intimacy to Everett's knowing eyes. Judge Clarkson, a silver-haired woman with penetrating eyes, reviewed the documents before her. This is a bail hearing for Everett Gray, charged with 3 counts of attempted murder in the first degree. Mr. Morell, you may present your arguments. Colin stepped forward. Your Honor, my client has no prior criminal record, strong ties to the community, and is not a flight risk. He's a business owner who employs 27 people locally. The evidence against him is entirely circumstantial. The prosecutor, District Attorney Olivia Diaz, countered. Your Honor, the defendant is accused of attempting to murder his wife and 6-year-old twins for insurance money. We have forensic evidence showing the brake lines were deliberately cut in a manner consistent with Mr. Gray's engineering expertise. Given the severity of these charges and the potential penalty of life imprisonment, we believe Mr. Gray poses both a flight risk and a danger to his family. Judge Clarkson turned to Everett. Mr. Gray, do you understand that if I grant bail, you will be prohibited from any contact with your wife and children pending trial? Yes, Your Honor, Everett replied, his voice steady despite the pain of being separated from his twins. After considering both arguments, the judge said, I'm setting bail at $1 million. The defendant will surrender his passport, submit to electronic monitoring, and remain at least 500 feet from his wife and children at all times. Colin's hand clasped Everett's shoulder in victory. $1 million was steep but manageable. Everett could liquidate some company assets. As the bailiff led him out, Everett locked eyes with Sabrina. For a fraction of a second, her mask slipped, revealing not fear or sadness, but irritation. She quickly recovered, leaning into Detective Sutter's protective embrace, playing the terrified victim. That brief glimpse of the real Sabrina confirmed everything Everett suspected. 3 days later, Everett sat in Colin's office, free but shackled by an ankle monitor. Iris, his younger sister, paced nervously. The media is camped outside your house, she said. You can't go back there. He'll stay with me, Colin decided. My guest house is private, secured, and technically owned by my law firm. It's the perfect place to regroup. Everett barely heard them. He was reviewing the forensic reports Colin had obtained. The brake line wasn't completely severed, he noted. It was partially cut, enough to cause eventual failure, but not immediate catastrophe. Colin nodded. Someone who wanted to create an accident but control where and when it happened. Someone who wanted to ensure the passengers survived, Everett added. This wasn't an attempted murder. It was an elaborate frame. Iris stopped pacing. But why? What does Sabrina gain? Everett looked up. That's what we need to find out. Colin, what did your investigator discover about Sabrina's finances? Colin pulled out a folder. She's been siphoning money from your joint accounts for 18 months. Small amounts, never enough to trigger your attention. The funds went to an account under the name Bryn Thomas, which we believe is an alias. Total transfers, about $217,000. Everett's jaw tightened. And Detective Sutter. More interesting by the day. Before becoming a detective, he worked in financial crimes. He's investigated 3 cases with similar patterns. Spouses accused of attempting to murder their partners for insurance money. All 3 resulted in convictions. Any connections between those cases and Sabrina? Colin hesitated. Not directly, but we found something else. He pushed forward a photograph. This was taken 2 years ago at a police charity gala. Your wife attended as part of her volunteer work with the Victim Support Program. The photo showed Sabrina laughing with several officers. Standing beside her, drink in hand, was Detective Sutter. They knew each other, Everett said quietly, long before the crash. There's more, Colin continued. Remember that lake house you mentioned? We found it. Purchased 6 months ago by Bryn Thomas, Sabrina's alias, in the Pinnicliff Mountains. Fully furnished, utilities connected. It looks like a getaway home. Everett stared at the property documents, mind racing. The government contract my company secured was 7 months ago. The financial opportunity made me more valuable to her dead or imprisoned than divorced. But why risk the twins in the crash? He asked, horrified. Because they're the beneficiaries of trust funds from your grandparents, Everett realized. Funds that Sabrina would control as their guardian if I were incarcerated. Funds she can't access in a normal divorce because I'm the trustee until they turn 21. The room fell silent as the full scope of Sabrina's plan became clear. We need more than theories, Colin finally said. We need hard evidence linking Sabrina and Sutter to the sabotage. Everett's expression hardened. I might know where to find it. The week before the crash, I installed a new security system at home, upgraded from our basic camera setup. Sabrina doesn't know that it backs up to my private cloud, not just the local storage she and Sutter probably deleted. Colin leaned forward. You have footage. If they tampered with the car the night before the crash, it should have captured something. I need access to my secure server at the office. That's risky, Colin cautioned. Your bail conditions prevent you from going to work. I don't need to go physically. I just need remote access and someone I trust inside the building. Everett turned to his sister. Iris, how good are your acting skills? Iris blinked. What do you have in mind? You're going to interview for an executive assistant position at my company. During the tour, you'll need access to my private office. As Everett outlined his plan, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his arrest. Control. The engineer in him was back in his element, designing a solution to a complex problem. The frame around him had been meticulously constructed, but now he would disassemble it the same way, piece by careful piece. The forensics lab hummed with activity as Dr. Mia Roberts examined the evidence from Everett's car. As the head of Advanced Forensic Analytics, an independent lab known for its cutting-edge technology, Mia had seen countless attempts to manipulate crime scenes. This case, however, had captured her professional curiosity. The partial severance of the brake line shows unusual characteristics, she explained to Colin and Everett, who watched intently. The cut was made with a specialized tool, likely a tube cutter designed for precision work. Something an engineer would have, Colin noted. Yes, but also something a professional mechanic would use, Mia countered. More importantly, we found microscopic metal shavings near the cut that don't match the composition of the brake line itself. Everett leaned forward, meaning the tool used left traces. Most tube cutters have a hardened steel wheel, but this one contained tungsten carbide, a premium material used in high-end tools. If we can locate the specific tool, it could exonerate you or confirm your guilt. I don't own any tools with tungsten carbide cutting wheels, Everett said. My equipment is standard grade. Mia nodded. There's more. We found partial fingerprints on the underside of the hood, areas that wouldn't normally be touched during routine maintenance. They were carefully wiped, but our new enhancement techniques revealed fragments. We're running comparisons now. Colin glanced at his watch. How long until results? 24 hours, maybe less. As they left the lab, Everett's phone buzzed with a message from Iris. Package secured. Meeting you at the safe house at 7 p.m. Colin raised an eyebrow. Your sister came through. She always does, Everett replied with the first genuine smile since his arrest. Iris arrived at Colin's guest house, clutching the small external hard drive. You were right. The cloud backup was intact. I downloaded everything from the week before the crash. The three gathered around Colin's laptop as Everett connected the drive. The security footage showed multiple camera angles of Everett's home, including the garage where the car had been parked. There, Everett said, freezing the playback. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. the night before the crash. A figure in dark clothing slipped into the garage through the side door. That's not Sabrina, Iris observed. Too tall. Keep watching, Everett said grimly. Moments later, Sabrina appeared in the frame, speaking to the intruder. Though the footage had no audio, their body language suggested intimacy, confirmed when Sabrina stood on tiptoes to kiss the man. Detective Sutter, Colin whispered as the man turned, his profile briefly illuminated by the garage's motion sensor light. They watched as Sutter opened the hood of Everett's car and began working underneath, occasionally referencing his phone as if following instructions. Sabrina stood watch, periodically checking the door to the house. They didn't know about the new camera system. The old one only covered the main entrance and driveway. After 20 minutes, Sutter closed the hood and showed something to Sabrina on his phone. Diagrams based on his gestures. She nodded, and they shared another kiss before Sutter departed through the side door. This is it, Colin said, eyes wide. This proves conspiracy and tampering. Sutter wasn't officially assigned to the case until after the crash, so he can't claim this was part of any investigation. Everett stared at the frozen image of his wife conspiring with her lover. We need to be careful how we use this. If they realize we have the footage, they might destroy other evidence. We need to find that tool first. Mia said it was high-end, with tungsten carbide components. Iris said, not something you'd buy at a local hardware store. Colin's phone rang, interrupting their planning. After a brief conversation, he turned to them with a surprised expression. That was Mia. They got a hit on one of the partial fingerprints. It's not a match for either you or Sabrina. Sutter, Everett asked. No, someone named Rick Valls. He has a record. 2 counts of auto theft 5 years ago. Now runs a repair shop called Rick's Auto Service on the south side. Everett frowned. I've never heard of him. But maybe Sabrina or Sutter has, Iris suggested. Could he be the supplier of the specialized tool? Colin was already pulling up information on his laptop. Rick's Auto Service is 4 miles from your house. Small operation, specializes in foreign imports. He does work for the Metro Police Department on undercover vehicles. The pieces began falling into place. Sutter would know this mechanic through work, Everett said. He could have gotten advice, tools, maybe even had him do a practice run on another vehicle. We need to talk to this Rick Valls, Colin decided. But carefully. If he's working with Sutter, he could tip him off. I have a better idea, Everett said, a plan forming in his mind. What if we don't approach him directly? What if we set a trap that gives him a reason to come forward on his own? Colin leaned back, intrigued. What kind of trap? The kind that appeals to someone with a history of crime who's trying to stay clean, fear and self-preservation. Everett turned to his sister. Iris, how convincing can you be as a desperate, frightened woman? Iris's expression hardened with determination. What do you need me to do? As Everett outlined his plan, he felt a dark satisfaction. For too long, he had been reacting to Sabrina and Sutter's scheme. Now it was time to seize the initiative. Rick Vallis wiped grease from his hands as he finished with a BMW's transmission. 10 years ago, he'd been boosting cars like this, not fixing them. 5 years of probation and a second chance from a sympathetic judge had set him on a different path. Now his repair shop, while small, had a solid reputation. He'd even secured a contract with the police department for their undercover vehicles. Ironic, given his history. The bell chimed as the front door opened. Rick stepped into the reception area to find a well-dressed woman in her mid-30s, anxiety clear on her face. "Rick Vallis?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "That's me. How can I help you?" The woman glanced nervously at the door before speaking. "My name is Iris. I need to talk to you about my brother, Everett Gray." Rick's expression remained neutral, but his heart rate accelerated. The Gray case had been all over the news. "What about him?" "I know you were involved," Iris said quietly. "Your fingerprints were found on his car, the one with the cut brake lines. The forensics lab has your prints. They'll be contacting the police soon." Rick felt the blood drain from his face. "Lady, I don't know what you're talking about. I never touched that car." "The forensics lab has your prints," Iris repeated. "But I came to you first because I think you were used. Detective Hugo Sutter brought you into this, didn't he? Probably told you it was police business." Rick's silence confirmed her suspicion. "Sutter isn't just a corrupt cop," Iris continued. "He's sleeping with my brother's wife. They set Everett up, and they used you. When this goes to trial, guess who they'll blame for the technical work? The ex-con with a record of auto theft." Rick sank into a chair, mind racing. "I didn't cut any brake lines. Sutter brought me a diagram. Asked if it would work to cause a controlled failure. Said it was for an undercover operation, testing vehicle sabotage detection. I told him it would work, gave him the right tool. He set me up as the fall guy." "There's a way out," Iris said. "My brother's lawyer can arrange immunity if you testify about Sutter's request. Otherwise, when those fingerprint results officially hit the police department." Rick rubbed his face, leaving a smudge of grease. "Sutter has friends in the department. If I talk, I'm a dead man. If you don't talk, you're going to prison. Again. But this time for attempted murder." After a long moment, Rick nodded. "What do you want to know?" Cullen's office buzzed with energy as he, Everett, and Iris processed Rick's statement, formally recorded by Cullen's investigator. Rick confirmed that Sutter approached him 3 weeks before the crash. Cullen summarized, asked for advice on creating a controlled brake failure for what he claimed was a police training exercise. Rick provided the specialized tube cutter and diagrams, but insists he never touched the actual vehicle. "His fingerprints say otherwise," Everett noted. He admits he examined similar brake lines on a police vehicle to demonstrate the technique, Cullen explained. "Those prints could have transferred via the tool Sutter borrowed." Iris leaned forward. "The important part is that Rick saw Sutter and Sabrina together at his shop a week before the crash. They didn't know he recognized her from the society pages. They were definitely intimate. Everett processed this information. So we have the security footage, Rick's statement, the fingerprint evidence, and now documentation of their prior relationship. Is it enough?" Cullen's expression was grim. "For reasonable doubt, yes. To get the charges dropped completely, we need more. Sutter is decorated, respected. It's still a he said, she said situation. Then we need someone else to corroborate," Everett decided. "Someone who saw them together when they claimed they hadn't met." "I've been digging into those previous cases," Cullen said. "The 3 where spouses were convicted of similar crimes. I found something interesting." He pulled out files. In each case, the accused had substantial life insurance or assets. In each case, Sutter was either the responding detective or took over the investigation early. And in each case, the surviving spouse sold their property within a year of conviction and moved away. You think Sutter has done this before? Help frame people for financial gain. I think it's worth looking into where those survivors ended up, and whether there's a money trail connecting them to Sutter. Everett stared at the case files, mind racing. We're still missing something crucial. Something that explains why Sabrina would risk everything, risk our children, for this scheme. Iris's phone chimed with a message. Her eyes widened as she read it. Mia has something. She wants us at the lab now. Dr. Mia Roberts looked exhausted but triumphant as they gathered around her workstation at Advanced Forensic Analytics. On her screen was a detailed chemical analysis. We found traces of a substance on the brake fluid reservoir cap, she explained. It's a specialized degrading agent that breaks down rubber seals gradually. When combined with the partial cut in a line, it creates a failure that appears natural, something that would happen during driving, not in a garage. Can this substance be traced? Colin asked. That's the breakthrough. It's not commercially available. It's a proprietary compound developed for the military to test vehicle vulnerabilities in extreme conditions. Maya looked directly at Everett. Guess who has a government contract to supply similar compounds for aerospace testing? Everett's breath caught. Gray Precision Engineering. Specifically, a classified project you began 7 months ago, Maya said. The compound found in your car is a variant of one stored in your company's secure lab. The implications hit Everett like a physical blow. Someone at my company is involved. Someone with access to restricted materials. Mia nodded. I ran employee background checks against Sutter's known associates. One name popped, Terrence Moreland, your head of security. Before joining your company 3 years ago, he worked for Metro PD. His supervisor, Hugo Sutter. Everett closed his eyes as pieces clicked into place. Terrence had access to every area of the facility, including the secure lab. He'd also been the one to recommend upgrading the home security system, likely knowing the exact capabilities of the original cameras. Terrence could have provided the compound, advised on the security systems, maybe even helped with the financial record manipulations, Everett said quietly. He has the technical expertise and the access. Colin was already making notes. We need to move carefully. If Terrence realizes we suspect him, he could destroy evidence or warn Sutter. I have an idea, Everett said, his expression hardening. But it's risky. And it means using myself as bait. As Everett outlined his plan, Mia and Colin exchanged concerned glances. The strategy was bold, potentially dangerous, but undeniably clever. You're talking about entrapment, Colin cautioned. I'm talking about giving them exactly what they want, Everett corrected. A vulnerable target who appears to be grasping at straws. Meanwhile, we'll be recording everything. The trial starts in 10 days, Colin reminded him. This plan needs to work quickly. Everett's eyes held a cold determination that sent a chill through the room. It will. Because unlike Sabrina and Sutter, I'm not underestimating my opponent. The trial began amidst a swarm of reporters on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as Everett climbed them beside Colin, capturing the dark circles under his eyes and the tailored suit hanging slightly looser on his frame after weeks of stress. Mr. Gray, do you have any response to your wife's allegations? How do you explain the evidence against you? Colin raised a hand, silencing the verge. My client maintains his complete innocence. We look forward to presenting the truth in court today. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with spectators and press. Everett spotted Sabrina in the front row, wearing a conservative gray dress, hair pulled back, the picture of a traumatized wife. Beside her sat Detective Sutter, professional, somber, a respectable distance between them. On the opposite side sat Iris, Dr. Mia Roberts, and a nervous Rick Vallis. Judge Clarkson called the court to order. The State versus Everett Gray will now commence. Are both sides ready for opening statements? District Attorney Olivia Diaz approached the jury first, painting Everett as a calculating man who had used his engineering expertise to attempt the perfect crime. The evidence will show that Mr. Gray meticulously planned to murder his family for financial gain. specialized tools, precise cuts to the brake lines, and a clear financial motive through multiple insurance policies. This wasn't a crime of passion, but a coldly calculated attempt to eliminate his family while making it appear accidental. When Colin's turn came, he addressed the jury with equal conviction. The prosecution's case relies on circumstantial evidence and ignores crucial facts. Yes, Everett Gray is an engineer. Yes, he maintained his own vehicles. But the evidence will show that someone else had the expertise, opportunity, and true motive to sabotage that car. Someone who carefully framed Mr. Gray to conceal a web of deception, infidelity, and greed. Over the next 3 days, the prosecution presented its case. Forensic experts testified about the brake line sabotage. Financial analysts detailed the insurance policies and alleged company struggles. Computer forensics laid out the damning search history from Everett's laptop. Throughout, Colin's cross-examinations planted seeds of doubt, suggesting that anyone could have researched brake failures online, that Everett's fingerprints would naturally be present on a car he routinely maintained, and that the financial struggles had been exaggerated through selective analysis. On the 4th day, Sabrina took the stand, the moment the media had been waiting for. Under Olivia Diaz's gentle questioning, she described a husband who had grown distant, obsessed with financial concerns, spending unusual time in the garage before the crash. "I never wanted to believe Everett could hurt us," she testified tearfully. "But after the crash, when the police showed me the evidence, I realized I never truly knew the man I married." Colin approached for cross-examination with calculated restraint. "Mrs. Gray, prior to your husband's arrest, how would you describe your marriage?" Sabrina maintained her composure. "Happy, I thought. But clearly, I was wrong. Would you say you were faithful throughout your marriage?" D.A. Diaz shot to her feet. "Objection. Relevance." "Your Honor," Colin countered, "the defense contends that Mrs. Gray's relationship with another man provided motive for framing her husband. It goes directly to motive and credibility." Judge Clarkson considered briefly. "I'll allow limited questioning on this line. Proceed carefully, Mr. Morell." Colin turned back to Sabrina. "Mrs. Gray, do you know Detective Hugo Sutter outside his professional capacity as the lead investigator in this case?" A flicker of unease crossed Sabrina's face, only through the investigation. "So you never met Detective Sutter before the day of the crash?" "No." Colin nodded, seemingly accepting her answer. "Mrs. Gray, are you familiar with the charity gala for the Police Benevolent Association held 2 years ago? You attended as part of your volunteer work." Sabrina hesitated. "I attend many charity functions." Colin approached with a photograph. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit 24. This shows Mrs. Gray at the gala in question, conversing with Detective Sutter." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the photograph was admitted. On the stand, Sabrina's composure slipped momentarily. "I meet many officers through my volunteer work. I didn't recall this specific interaction." "Mrs. Gray, are you familiar with the property in the Pinnacliff Mountains purchased 6 months ago by someone named Bryn Thomas?" Sabrina's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "No." "Interesting." Colin produced another document. "Because we have financial records showing transfers from your personal account to one under the name Bryn Thomas, who then purchased this lakefront property." "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit 25. Again, D.A. Diaz objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Sabrina's reaction, the momentary panic before she regained control. Colin led her through more questions that seemed manageable in isolation, but were devastating in total. With each answer, she dug herself deeper into provable lies. When Colin finally returned to his seat, Everett noted the sheen of perspiration on Sabrina's forehead. Across the courtroom, Detective Sutter's jaw was clenched, his eyes darting between Sabrina, Colin, and the jury. That evening, in Colin's office, the defense team reviewed their progress. "Sabrina held up better than I expected," Iris said. "But she made critical mistakes," Colin noted. "Denying knowing Sutter before the crash, when we have photographic evidence. claiming no knowledge of the Pinnicliff property, despite the financial trail. The jury saw those contradictions. Everett remained focused on the next phase. What about Terrence Moreland? Our investigator reports he took the bait, Mia confirmed. After receiving that accidental email about secure server access, he spent 3 hours in the company lab last night. The monitoring software tracked his searches. He was looking for ways to corrupt the security footage backup. Perfect, Everett said. And Rick is prepared for tomorrow. Colin nodded. He's nervous, but committed. His testimony about Sutter requesting the specialized tool could be the turning point. Everett stared out the window at the city lights. And the final piece. Our surprise witness. Confirmed, Colin said with a satisfied smile. Ready to testify on Monday. For the first time since his arrest, Everett allowed himself to imagine victory, not just legal exoneration, but complete vindication. The engineer who had been framed was about to demonstrate the dangers of underestimating a methodical mind. The courtroom fell silent as Rick Valls took the stand. The mechanic fidgeted with his tie, clearly uncomfortable in formal attire, and under the intense scrutiny of the gallery. After establishing Rick's credentials and background, Colin moved to the heart of the matter. Mr. Valls, did you have any interaction with Detective Hugo Sutter regarding brake systems prior to the crash involving the Gray family? Rick cleared his throat. Yes, about 3 weeks before the accident, Detective Sutter came to my shop. Said he needed consultation on a special police project about vehicle sabotage detection. And what specifically did he ask you? He showed me diagrams of brake systems. Wanted to know how to create what he called a controlled failure, something that would cause brakes to fail during operation, but not immediately after tampering. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. At the prosecution table, Olivia Diaz whispered urgently to her assistant, while Detective Sutter stared at Rick with barely concealed anger. Did Detective Sutter request any specific tools from you? Colin asked. Yes, he borrowed my precision tube cutter with the tungsten carbide wheel. Said he needed it for demonstration purposes. Returned it 4 days later. Colin approached with an evidence bag. Is this the tool in question? Rick examined it through the plastic. Yes, that's mine. You can see the RVI etched on the handle. My initials. And Mr. Valls, did you ever see Detective Sutter with anyone else during these interactions? Rick hesitated, then nodded. Once, a blonde woman came to the shop with him. They seemed close. I recognized her later on the news as Mrs. Gray. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Clarkson gavelled for order. Colin pressed on. Mr. Valls, why didn't you come forward with this information earlier? I was scared. Rick admitted. Sutter's a cop. He knows people. And I've got a record. Who would believe me over him? But then the forensics lab found my fingerprints from when I handled that tool, and I realized I was being set up as the fall guy. During cross-examination, D.A. Diaz attacked Rick's credibility, pointing out his criminal record and suggesting immunity had motivated him to lie. But Rick stayed consistent, his simple, direct answers resonating with the jury. When Rick stepped down, Colin called his next witness. The defense calls Terrence Moreland. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Terrence, Everett's head of security, had not been listed as a defense witness. As he reluctantly approached the stand, Everett observed Detective Sutter shifting uncomfortably, whispering something to D.A. Diaz. After swearing in, Terrence sat rigidly. Mr. Moreland, Colin began, what is your position at Gray Precision Engineering? Head of security, Terrence replied. I oversee physical and digital security for the company. And before that, I was with Metro Police Department for 12 years. Did you work with Detective Hugo Sutter during that time? Terrence hesitated. Yes, he was my supervisor for 3 years. Colin established Terrence's access to all areas of Gray Precision Engineering, including the secure lab containing specialized compounds. Then he shifted tactics. Mr. Moreland, 3 nights ago, you accessed the secure lab. Can you explain why? Terence paled. Routine security check. At 11:47 p.m. Accessing files related to the proprietary compounds used in military testing. I don't recall specific files, Terence muttered. Colin approached with a printout. This is a log of your activity that night, captured by monitoring software on the company server. It shows you spent 42 minutes examining files related to rubber-degrading compounds, the exact compound found in Mr. Gray's vehicle. Terence's composure cracked. I want a lawyer. Judge Clarkson intervened, advising Terence of his rights. After consulting with a court-appointed attorney, Terence returned to the stand with a new strategy. Silence. To each of Colin's questions, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The impact on the jury was profound. Without saying a word, Terence had confirmed the defense's theory of conspiracy and inside assistance. As court adjourned for the day, Everett noticed Sabrina and Sutter in an intense, whispered argument near the prosecutor's table. Their perfect plan was unraveling, strand by strand. The next morning, Colin dropped a bombshell. Your Honor, the defense calls a surprise witness, Officer Calvin Reyes. Judge Clarkson frowned. Mr. Morrell, surprise witnesses are generally not permitted. Your Honor, Officer Reyes only came forward yesterday after learning of Mr. Moreland's testimony. As the first responding officer at the crash scene, his testimony is critical and could not have been anticipated. After hearing arguments from both sides, Judge Clarkson allowed the witness. Calvin, a fresh-faced patrol officer, took the stand with obvious nervousness. Officer Reyes, Colin began, you were the first responder at the scene of the gray car crash, correct? Yes, sir. Was that a coincidence, or were you directed to be in that area? Calvin swallowed hard. I was told to patrol Crestwood Road that morning. Detective Sutter suggested it needed extra coverage due to recent complaints. So Detective Sutter positioned you near the exact location where the crash would later occur. Objection, Diaz called. Speculation. Sustained, the judge ruled. Colin rephrased. Officer Reyes, what did you observe when you arrived at the scene? The vehicle had struck the safety barrier. Mrs. Gray was very upset, claiming the brakes had failed. The children were scared but not seriously injured. Did Mrs. Gray say anything specific about her husband? Calvin looked uncomfortable. She mentioned that her husband had been working on the car the night before, said he'd been acting strange, mentioned something about insurance. Did this strike you as unusual? A crash victim immediately suggesting her husband might be responsible. At the time, I was focused on securing the scene. But thinking back, yes, it seemed rehearsed. The way she brought up the insurance and her husband's behavior, like she wanted to make sure I noted it in my report. And did Detective Sutter arrive at the scene? Yes, about 30 minutes later. Was that standard procedure for a detective to respond to what appeared to be a simple traffic accident? No, sir. Usually we'd just file a report unless there were fatalities or major injuries. So how did Detective Sutter know to come to the scene? Calvin looked down. He said he heard it on the radio, but later I checked the logs. The crash was never broadcast, and when he arrived, he and Mrs. Gray kept their distance, acted like they didn't know each other. But I saw them exchange a look when they thought no one was watching. Officer Reyes, why are you coming forward now? Because I became a cop to uphold the law, not help frame innocent people. After hearing about Mr. Moreland's involvement and the evidence against Detective Sutter, I couldn't stay silent anymore. During cross-examination, Diaz struggled to undermine Calvin's credibility. Unlike Rick Valls, he had no criminal record and no immunity deal. His simple honesty resonated with the jury. By day's end, momentum had shifted dramatically in Everett's favor. As the court adjourned, Everett noticed Sabrina slip out a side door, avoiding reporters. Detective Sutter remained behind, engaged in intense discussion with Diaz. Colin leaned close to Everett. Diaz is going to want a deal. Sutter is toxic to their case now. Everett shook his head. No deals. I want complete exoneration, and I want them to pay for what they did to me and my children. Colin studied his client's face. Over months of work together, he had watched Everett transform from a shell-shocked victim to a strategic force. The mild-mannered engineer had revealed an inner steel that surprised everyone, except perhaps Sabrina, who had disastrously underestimated him. "Tomorrow," Colin said, "we present our final witness, the one that will end this case once and for all." Everett nodded, grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Tomorrow, we closed the trap." The courthouse buzzed with anticipation. News of Officer Rice's testimony had spread overnight, tilting public opinion. Outside, the crowd that once vilified Everett now murmured about corruption and frame-ups. Sabrina arrived looking strained, her careful victim facade showing cracks. Detective Sutter entered separately, a calculated move, but too late to be convincing. Colin leaned over to Everett. "Diaz requested a meeting this morning. Offered a deal. They drop all charges in exchange for immunity for Sabrina on conspiracy counts. Sutter, they're cutting him loose, willing to let him face charges if it means saving face for the DA's office." Everett's expression hardened. "I told you, no deals. Not after what they did." Colin nodded, unsurprised. "Then we proceed with our final witness." Judge Clarkson called the court to order. "Mr. Morell, you may call your next witness." Colin stood. "The defense calls Louis Montoya." A heavy-set man in his 50s walked to the stand, his weathered face suggesting decades of outdoor work, and calloused hands revealing manual labor. After establishing Louis's job as the maintenance supervisor for Ridgeview Estates, the residential area near Crestwood Road, Colin got to the key questions. "Mr. Montoya, were you working in the vicinity of Crestwood the morning of the crash?" "Yes. I was checking the irrigation system near the safety barrier. We had complaints about water pooling on the road." "Did you witness anything unusual before the crash?" Louis nodded. "Around 7:15 that morning, I saw a blonde woman and a man in the turnout, just up from where the crash happened later. They were looking at the barrier, talking and pointing. I thought maybe they were property buyers." "Can you identify these individuals?" Colin produced photographs of Sabrina and Detective Sutter. Louis studied them. "Yes, that's them. The same people I saw that morning." "What time did the actual crash occur?" "About 8:30. I heard the impact and ran over." "So approximately 1 hour before the crash, Mrs. Gray and Detective Sutter were examining the exact location where the vehicle would later hit the barrier." "Yes, sir." The courtroom erupted in whispers. At the prosecution table, Diaz closed her eyes, recognizing the case was lost. Sutter glared at Louis with undisguised hatred. Colin continued. "Mr. Montoya, why didn't you come forward with this information earlier?" "I did tell the police at the scene that I'd seen the woman earlier. Detective Sutter was there by then. He took my statement, said he'd follow up, but it never appeared in any reports, and no one ever contacted me again." "So Detective Sutter deliberately omitted your statement from the official record?" "Objection," Diaz called, though without her earlier fire. "Speculation." "Sustained," Judge Clarkson said, but she looked visibly disturbed. Colin rephrased. "Mr. Montoya, how can you be so certain about what you saw that morning?" Louis reached into his pocket and produced his phone. "Because I took pictures. I'm an amateur photographer, landscapes mostly. I was checking spots for sunrise photos when I saw them. They were standing right where I wanted to shoot. So I waited, took a few angles with them in the distance to check the lighting." After verifying authenticity, the court admitted the photos. They showed Sabrina and Sutter at the crash site an hour before the accident, measuring distances by stepping out the space. Diaz offered a half-hearted attempt at suggesting innocent explanations, but the jury clearly wasn't buying it. When Louis stepped down, Colin addressed the court. "Your Honor, the defense rests." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, remarkably fast for an attempted murder case. As they filed back in, Everett read the verdict on their faces before it was announced. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, We find the defendant, Everett Gray, not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Everett closed his eyes, relief washing over him as months of false accusation fell away. Judge Clarkson restored order before addressing Everett. "Mr. Gray, you are free to go. This court offers its sincerest apologies for the ordeal you've endured." She then turned to the prosecutor's table. "Based on evidence presented in this trial, I am instructing the district attorney's office to immediately open investigations into Detective Hugo Sutter, Sabrina Gray, and Terrence Moreland for conspiracy, evidence tampering, perjury, and obstruction of justice." As the courtroom cleared, Everett watched Sabrina being led away by her attorney, their eyes meeting briefly. The mask of victimhood was gone, replaced by cold fury, and beneath it, fear. Detective Sutter was already in custody, surrendering his badge and gun to internal affairs officers who had been waiting for the verdict. Outside, on the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed around Colin and Everett. Colin fielded questions while Everett stood silent but victorious. "Mr. Gray will be filing civil suits against all parties involved," Colin announced. "Additionally, he will be petitioning for full custody of his children, who were callously endangered by their mother's actions." A reporter called out, "Mr. Gray, what do you have to say to your wife now?" Everett stepped forward. "Nothing. She will answer to the courts, to our children, and to her own conscience. My focus now is healing my family and rebuilding what this ordeal has taken." 6 months later, Everett stood on the deck of his new home, watching as Dylan and Bella played in the fenced yard below. The twins had shown remarkable resilience, though they continued therapy to process their mother's betrayal. Sabrina had ultimately accepted a plea deal, 20 years for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and child endangerment. Detective Sutter, refusing to cooperate, faced trial and received 30 years. Terrence Moreland had turned state's evidence, receiving a reduced sentence in exchange for detailing the conspiracy. The civil suits had been settled out of court, providing financial security for the twins' future. More importantly, Everett had secured sole custody, with Sabrina's parental rights permanently terminated due to her willingness to endanger the children. Gray Precision Engineering had not just survived but thrived, expanding its government contract and strengthening security protocols. Iris joined her brother on the deck, handing him a coffee. "The twins seem better every day." Everett nodded. "Kids are adaptable, more than adults sometimes." "And you? How are you really doing?" He considered the question. The experience had changed him fundamentally. The trusting engineer still existed, but now he understood a harsher truth. Justice sometimes has to be engineered. "I'm rebuilding," he finally said. "Different blueprints this time. Stronger foundations." Iris smiled, recognizing the engineer's metaphor. "Our investigator finally tracked down the money from Sabrina's hidden accounts. They recovered about 60%. It was never about the money," Everett said. "It was about the truth, and making sure Dylan and Bella grow up knowing that justice eventually prevails, even if the system initially fails." Below, the twins laughed as they chased each other around the yard, their young lives beginning to heal. Everett watched them with quiet satisfaction. The perfect frame had been dismantled, piece by meticulous piece, by the very man it was designed to destroy. 15 years later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the headquarters of Graytech, the global enterprise that had grown from Everett's original company. Now 55, Everett stood at the window of his top-floor office, watching employees arrive. His hair had grayed at the temples, and fine lines marked the passage of time, but his posture was straight and his gaze as analytical as ever. "Dad, got a minute?" Dylan asked, appearing in the doorway. At 21, he was a final-year student at a prestigious tech institute, interning at Graytech. "Always for you," Everett said, gesturing for Dylan to join him at a table spread with architectural plans for an overseas expansion. They discussed design modifications, and Everett listened with pride as his son proposed improvements. Dylan had inherited his father's engineering mind and was already proving himself invaluable. When they finished, Dylan lingered. "I got a letter yesterday. From her." No clarification was needed. Even after 15 years, Sabrina was simply her. Everett's expression remained calm. What did she want? To meet. She's being released next month on parole. Bella already said no. She doesn't even want to know where Mom is living. Everett absorbed this, inwardly noting the tightness in his chest. "Are you considering it?" "I don't know," Dylan admitted. "Part of me wants answers. Whatever you decide, you have my support." Dylan thanked him, then left to work on another project. As Everett gazed out the window, he reflected on how much life had changed. Sabrina's betrayal had altered everything, but it had also forged a resilience in his family that even time couldn't diminish. He stepped out of his office to meet with Dr. Mia Roberts, whose forensic company, AFA, was now partnering with Graytech. They discussed a potential acquisition that would merge their respective innovations. Over coffee afterward, Mia hesitated. "Greg." "Sorry, Hugo. Detective Sutter passed away an hour ago," she said quietly. "Prison attack. It just came through on the wires." Everett felt surprisingly little. Sutter had been the architect of so much misery, not just for him but for others. Yet Everett had released that hatred long ago. "It doesn't change anything for me," he said. "That chapter closed 15 years ago." Mia nodded, compassion in her gaze. "Some people never learn accountability." "It's over," Everett said simply. Later, Everett returned home, where Bella and Dylan joined him for dinner. They described how they had each navigated their mother's recent letters. Bella, now a doctoral student in psychology, had chosen not to reply. Dylan was still uncertain. "Whatever happens," Everett told them, "we stay a family. We decide our future together." After they left, Everett stepped onto his terrace, overlooking the city lights. He sipped tea, remembering the crucible that had nearly destroyed him, only to make him stronger. By defending himself against the perfect frame, he had created something far more enduring, a legacy of integrity, rebuilt piece by piece from the wreckage of betrayal. There, under the quiet of the night sky, Everett Gray allowed himself a single, satisfied reflection. Some frames fail spectacularly, and sometimes the very man targeted by deception ends up building the strongest life of all.